Mark Gober, welcome to the Story Engine podcast.
Kyle, thank you for having me on.
You are a deep thinker, and based on a lot of the books that you've made and the conversations that you've had, you do a lot of thinking in a lot of different places. And so I know that this is a tough question to start out this conversation with, but can you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you're showing up in the world today?
Well, I'll also give a little context of how I got here because I'm on a journey that I never expected I would have been on. In many ways, it just keeps taking these unexpected turns. But my background is a very traditional one. I worked in investment banking in New York and then in Silicon Valley. So I was on a business career track. And while I was working in Silicon Valley in 2016, I started listening to podcasts and became exposed to topics about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, scientific evidence that's suggestive of phenomena people might call spiritual, quote unquote. But it really changed my worldview to know that wow, there are people studying things that challenge the way that I looked at life. And long story short, I've been on a journey for 8 years now, which has led to many books, and each book seems to represent a paradigm shift of my own. But while I started in that one domain of looking at the science of consciousness starting in 2016, and my first book was published in 2018, I've ventured into new areas and even left my job right before all the lockdowns and everything in early 2020, late 2019. I left, but I've also covered political and economic theory, some sociological issues, the notion of contact with non-human intelligence, medicine. So very distinct but somewhat interrelated areas. And that's where I find myself today, which is continuing to question the assumptions that I've had throughout my life and trying to understand why is it I believe the things that I believe. And often when I engage in that, I find that my assumptions were based on flimsy ideas, and then I end up shifting my paradigm. So I find myself in that place again, where number one, I'm readjusting to new paradigms that I've been writing about. There's an integration process because the writing process for me actually is solidifying the paradigm shift. And it forces me to do that because I'm always citing sources. It's not just stream of consciousness. And in that process of going through all the details, it becomes embedded in my blueprint. But then there's a part of me after the project is done where there's a realization that the paradigm shift happened and there's no product to worry about anymore because the book is out. And then I say, wait, how do I actually adjust to this paradigm shift that I've described? How do I embody that and be in the world? And because it's happened so many times now in the last 8 years, I find myself in this state of disorientation in a way, but also feeling stable in a way because I'm stable in the fact that I'm accustomed to challenging my paradigms. That is stability, but the instability is in the fact that I'm shifting my paradigms constantly.
There's a lot of gold in here, and I resonate with you and your process in a lot of different ways in my own creative process and discovery process. And the first thing that comes to mind when I hear what you're saying is I remember living in Thailand when it comes to paradigms. And I've told this story a few times on the podcast before, but when I went to a Thai restaurant, and I remember one day noticing for the first time that Thai people used forks and knives differently than I'd ever been taught before. And instead of like an American, we would stab our food with the fork and then just put it into our mouth. The Thai people would kind of use their fork and kind of push their food into their spoon and then hold their spoon up. Not a big difference. But I had never, before seeing that, I had never asked the question, is there a different way to use these? Maybe the idea of chopsticks could have allowed such a new thing. But a lot of the times these paradigm shifts, it's hard to question without the contrast. And it seems like you've been able to see new opportunities and new things where many people haven't, or you've been inspired by a curiosity and allowed yourself to open up to a paradigm shift that is explored through the writing of your book. Another thing that I have spoken about on this podcast is writing a book crystallizes your knowledge. You actually wrestle with the idea and make it a good idea. You don't have a good idea and then write a book. the writing of the book makes your idea good. And so to just respond to this in large and then bring us into the next question, what I'm so curious about is what is the moment, or what are the moments of what's in common between each time you have one of these ideas that inspires a book? What's happening to you? Is there, are there patterns that you see within this now?
The pattern is a feeling that is difficult to describe, but I'm called to something that I find interesting. And the timing always is part of it too, because there might be a topic that 5 years ago did not call me, but then 2 years later it did, even though I was exposed to it at one point. So there's a timing. So I have to be in the right place for whatever reason for a certain topic, and then I get pulled in that direction. And I just know the sensation of I have to explore this. That's basically what it turns into. And often these are ideas that, let's say, people have heard of, but maybe haven't felt the desire to actually explore. They might have a superficial opinion on it. Whereas for some reason, I get pulled to say, let me look really deeply into this, look at the primary sources. And the research is actually in many ways the writing process. The writing for me is compressed. I end up doing that quickly with the word processor and everything and typing it out. But the real writing is the learning and building of the framework in my own mind, which takes a much longer period.
You mentioned describing this process on our introductory call a few weeks ago, and you'll read as many books on the process and immerse yourself deeply in it. And it goes back to one of my points. Somebody talked to me about getting a PhD, and I told them to just write a book. And I think if they wrote a book following the process that you particularly described there, it would be as transformative, if not more. I think that's a great way to do it. What guides the questions you ask or your research process? How do you, because so much happens before the writing, how are you just taking as much content as possible? What happens if you get a little bit of data? Does this change? How does really like going through the consuming and sorting of this work for you?
It's unstructured. It's unstructured in that I go from one thing to the next based on intuition, basically, or I might just call it passion of what I feel called to learn about. And it can change where, let's say 2 days ago, I was learning all about one thing, but then that's not interesting because I've learned enough of what I feel like I need to learn about it. Now I'm on to the next thing. And I let that process guide me. And typically I reach a point where the amount of incremental learning is diminished, where I'm coming across the same ideas repeatedly. It's not really, I'm not shifting my paradigms. And at that point, a framework typically emerges within my mind to think about all the different things that I've looked at with all the books and the podcasts and the lectures that I've listened to and papers and things like that. So then it congeals basically. And in my mind, I can actually lay out what the argument is for this paradigm shift that I'm having within myself. And then it feels uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is, I feel like I need to share this information and get it out of my mind and put that framework into a structure that someone else could actually read. Otherwise, I can't function. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's actually what it feels like. I've got to get it done. And that's why the writing process is so compressed, because I do it as quickly as I can in order to empty out. And then there's a relief process, and then there's editing and the details. But that's how it's gone every time.
Is this something that you just naturally did? You were kind of guided by your own intuition and impulses to develop this process, or was there even like, I'm going to learn how to write books, and read a bunch of books and then kind of pieced this together for yourself? But it sounds like from what I'm gathering, this is something very natural and innate to who you are. It's like you're getting out of your own way rather than trying to make anything happen.
That's very perceptive. That's how it's been, but I never would have thought that that's how I functioned when I started on this journey in 2016. I just wanted to learn for the sake of learning. I had no thought about output. Now I can see before it happens, I say, okay, there's probably a book coming here. I know I've seen this before. When I started, I wasn't thinking that way. I was still in my Silicon Valley career. I thought, I'm just interested in this work, interested in learning. And it was a year into that research where I said, well, I should really summarize this stuff. And then at that point, even after I wrote that first book, I thought, okay, I wrote one book. I'm going to stick with my career in Silicon Valley. This is not going to be it. This is not going to happen again. So I think you're right that there's something within me. It's just my process. Also, I've been trained professionally to do things like this, especially my job working with tech companies. I had to take in massive amounts of information on a certain technology and learn about the market, learn about the intellectual property involved with it, which was very technical from a legal standpoint, but also in terms of understanding technology. And I was doing this for different clients. So I was accustomed to jumping into a new space and having to understand it at a level where I could explain it to CEO board level, which usually wanted kind of a summary, but also be able to interface with the lawyers and interface with the technology people. So now when I do this in areas that I'm more passionate about because it's coming from me rather than a client directive, it feels natural because I've done this. So it's not intimidating. It was intimidating at one point for me, but it's sort of just like I was trained to do this.
Yeah. I'm curious then, and there's a certain theory I have, but what are your goals with your books? And again, there some of this, it seems like it's like coming from you, but how would you like to see the world uh, be impacted or thought differently or changed? And maybe each book kind of has a different application of this, or like what do you want the long run of your life? It sounds like I want to be writing more books and continuing to follow this process. What would that add up to for you?
Well, in terms of looking out in the future, it's hard for me to say. I tell people all the time, this might be the last book I write. Maybe I'm done because I don't know what the next thing's going to be. So I always find myself in that position. In terms of the goals, it's shifted. When I first started and had this paradigm shift with the nature of consciousness, I thought, wow, it would really, this has helped my life so much. If other people understood this, it would make the world such a better place. And I really wanted to get as many people as possible. But what I learned is that people have to be ready to take something in. They have to want to do it on their own. Not everyone is willing to have a paradigm shift, no matter what evidence you present to them. And I feel less called to change people. It's more about I need to feel like I've done a good job of presenting the paradigm shift. And if I do that, that really feels sufficient to me from a level of satisfaction of I got it out there. But then there is a part of me that says, I spent so much time, I would love for more people to take this in and maybe I can relate to them more, or just the desire to actually have it distributed more. And then there is the practical perspective, which is in many ways independent of these more like idealistic ways of looking at it, which is why I started. I wasn't thinking about this as a business. I was working in business and this was a side hobby. But it would be nice if I got my books to more people from like a cash flow perspective, because writing books is, I'm not sure how many of your audience members know the economics. It's not a, unless you're a huge author, it's hard to actually have a positive outcome financially. And that's not why I do it in the first place. But I have thought about it more and more where wouldn't it be great if more people would read it and have the positive paradigm shifts and it could be self-funding? That would be pretty cool.
Absolutely. I'm curious now that it's all about paradigm shifts, and I'm trying to understand just fitting things into a certain lens and framework for me. Everything's been your willingness to explore and open up new ideas and question your own way of thinking. And there's a certain problem if we did not allow this process for yourself or ourselves generally as humans, that I think we would slow ourselves down, but we want to resist it at the same time. We never want to change our paradigms. I don't I are at least not from the start. I think we like it. There's a certain, it feels comfortable and it's good for, I feel safe if I understand the paradigm around me. And if I don't, then there's, yeah, like all kinds of things can come into question. But it also leaves us with blind spots. It leaves us with challenges if we never do question it. Was there
Yes.
was there ever like a time or experience where you were, either unwilling to question something, or maybe you had an idea and a new perspective and somebody else just wasn't willing to see it at all. They were attached to the old paradigm.
In many ways, it's the story of my creative journey. Each paradigm that I shift on my own, there are people, new people, who are no longer aligned with me. And that is challenging because I think there's a human tendency to want to be able to relate to people, but then also just I used to work in client services. So I was judged on the basis of whether or not people liked what I presented to them. So there is a bit of a bias within me for people to like what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And with regard to the paradigm shifts themselves, the discomfort, it's a really important point you raised, because I've committed myself to the truth at all costs, whatever the truth is, even if it upsets people. And it's led me into some uncomfortable areas where in some cases I'll start writing the book because I have an inclination that the paradigm shift is there, but sometimes I need to actually write it out for me to convince myself. And then I convince myself and say, oh no, can I really publish something like this? I mean, my most recent book on medicine is a good example. It came out at the end of 2023, and it challenges some of the fundamentals of germ theory, for example. Like, these are fundamental aspects of the allopathic system. And I started off writing it with the inclination that there's something really important here that I had seen a lot of evidence for. And it wasn't until I put it all together where I said, wow, there's an important paradigm shift. What are people going to think? And what do I think? Because I resisted it at first. There's no way these paradigm shifts could be true. Is that possible? Could I really have been that far off? Could so many smart people and doctors be that far off? How could that be possible? So that does arise within me. I would just say, though, that it's happened so many times now that it's less discomfort. It's more observation. I
Mm-hmm.
see it arise and say, oh, I know what this is. I've seen this before. Whereas in the beginning, it was destabilizing. My goodness, like in 2016, I didn't know anyone that was talking about these kinds of spiritual esoteric topics from a scientific lens. No one in my network was thinking this way. And I was thinking to myself, first of all, I don't know how to live with these new beliefs. And secondly, who can I even talk to about this stuff?
Hmm. This is interesting. Do you remember a specific time wrestling with these thoughts, or a specific thought? Maybe this was the first book. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was reading this, and I just got confronted with this idea, and I'm like, am I really going to tell the truth here? The truth that I see, or follow this truth?
Huh. There are so many examples of this. The first thing that comes to mind for me is back in 2016, I was listening to a podcast. It's called Healing Powers. The host, her name is Laura Powers, and I had heard her on a podcast called Extreme Health Radio talking about health. And her work is around, let's just say, interdimensional communication. So really out there stuff for someone like me in the business world. And I didn't realize how many people had these experiences. And she interviewed a man named Paul Davids, who is a Hollywood producer. He produced the Transformers, and we have an almost identical background academically. So we both went to Princeton undergrad and were in the psychology department. So I had heard other people on her podcast talk about this stuff, but then Paul Davids comes on. He's saying his background, and I know where he came from, even though he went into film and I went into business and things like that. And he's a bit older than me, but I know what he was trained with because we had similar training. And he came to
Mm-hmm.
this conclusion that his colleague, who was an atheist before he died, and said to him, look, I don't think there's an afterlife, but if there is, I'm going to drop you a line. And the bizarre things that happened to Paul, it left me in my chair. I couldn't move. I mean, he was talking about, I'll just give one example. And he documents this in a documentary and also his book, An Atheist in Heaven, where he was at home by himself and left the room, and he came back and his papers had ink crossed out certain words on the papers, and he hadn't done that, and it was still wet ink. And it turns out the words that were crossed out corresponded to the person that had died. And then he sent the ink to chemistry labs for 3 years, and they couldn't understand the composition of it with his own money. So that was just one example out of many. And I couldn't move because the implications of, I heard that on top of other pieces of evidence and scientific papers where I don't know what's true, but there were things that challenged my belief systems. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do with my life? Because this is totally new. And I was frozen.
Tell me what room you were in.
I was I was in Hayes Valley in San Francisco. about to have a body work treatment. So I was in the waiting room listening on my headphones to a podcast.
Mhm. That's awesome. Great story. Let's find another story now. Tell me about a time, maybe this will be later on with the books, and somebody, maybe it's you, like you integrating this new understanding or feeling served, or maybe somebody that you've met or came up to you and was like, I see the world differently, thanks for showing me a better way through your books and your process. I'm sure you've had many, but is there, if we could pick out one gem to showcase?
So the irony, Kyle, is that the ones I remember are the negative ones much more.
Ooh.
Those are the ones that stand out, of the people who say, you're crazy, or I can't believe you're doing this. I've lost respect for you. I'm paraphrasing, but I've had some pretty strong comments depending on the paradigm that I have shifted on. And ironically, I might have been aligned with that person 2 books prior, but then the new one, all of a sudden, Mark, I lost respect for you. So I remember a lot of those, and sometimes they're emails, sometimes they're in person. Um, but no, yeah, my first book, the positive comments actually do stand out most, because that was my first time doing something like this, and I had no idea what it was like to be an author and just put content out. It's almost in a blind fashion, where you put it out, and most people, you don't even know who's absorbing your content a lot of the time, and I probably never will. But sometimes I do hear from people, and they were saying that their lives shifted and they were looking at life very differently in a positive way. So I can remember a number of examples where it was either in person or getting a text message or an email.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to particularly the art and science of paradigm shifting, that you can't really be doing a good job at it if you're not making people upset. But that's really, I think this is what's interesting about you. And there's this uh, a, a, a drive within you to pursue the truth beyond your own instincts of like wanting to be liked, for example.
Yeah.
And there's just something that's pulling you at this. And I think that there's something unique here, and maybe this is kind of the golden thread that we're doing, but it's also part of growth. You mentioned, like, I might have agreed with this person a couple of books ago, and it's enabling us every time we have the paradigm shift. It allows us a new platform, but it's also something we have to have a taste for discomfort and uncertainty in order to ascend to that next level.
Yeah, it's as if my dedication to the truth, which is the intention that I feel like I set, whether explicitly or implicitly, it's being tested at all times. So I get a new topic where it's like, all right, here it is, Mark. Are you going to go after it? You're going to upset some people. You're going to lose people that they were with you the first 4 books. Book number 5, it's really going to get them. Are you going to do it? Because here's all the logic and here's all the data, and it's the intensity of that is increasing with each paradigm. It becomes more and more controversial, and I'm being tested more and more. But I'm starting to think now it's a bit like the breaking the 4-minute mile, where no one did it
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, and then when one person broke the 4-minute mile time, then many people did. So it's like, for whatever reason, certain paradigms, I don't know, I'm not saying I'm the first person, but maybe I'm early relative to mainstream, and if I'm able to overcome it, maybe it makes the barrier less intimidating for other people.
Yeah. Why do you think it's important right now more than ever to be questioning and overcoming paradigms?
Kyle, I apologize. You cut out. I didn't hear your question.
Oh, no problem at all. And I'll just mark this right here. Most of the time, there's been a few little blips here and there, and most of the time it records on each side. So we'll just cut this out, and there'll be no problem. But my question was, why do you think it's important right now more than ever that people be questioning and opening up to new paradigms?
Hmm. Well, I think I can just say from my own experience that it has been liberating. That's probably the summary, that my own consciousness has been liberated, which then affects my decision making and the way that I approach life. And it gets to a meta issue that you're touching on. It's sort of like where my research is leading me, that we live in a world in which the paradigms are upside down. My books are all about upside down this and upside down that. The irony is I started with one upside down thing and didn't know there were going to be more and more. But I think we do live in an upside down world in many ways, in which the nature of reality is something very different than what we are taught, and very different than what we assume to be true. And it just seems like living in alignment with truth, and the more of us that can do it collectively, that would just be better, versus fighting reality and living against the grain. Ultimately, that's where I think this stuff heads, is a shift in our collective consciousness, which then makes the world a better place. But it starts with the individual's liberated consciousness. And that's why going through these paradigm shifts is so important. But in my process, it starts with me having the paradigm shift first. The book is the byproduct of that process.
Mm-hmm. And it's an important tool for growth and change right now. I think our abilities to be able to see and shift our paradigms and adapt are being tested and challenged more than ever. And I think that this is an essential skill for advancing and thriving in a world with so much information, with so many arguments to be made, and so many ways that they can be supported or refuted, and many different truths out there to really be explored. It reminds me of something. I'm curious how you will receive this, but it's a concept I talk about called courtroom truth, that when I'm working with a lot of my clients in one-on-one, there's a couple of different kinds of truth. And the first level is courtroom truth. And a lot of times this is like, we would want to be as detailed as possible when we are on the stand to like talk about exactly what happened. And then there's a truth of the story, or a truth of the moment, of something that's valuable to you. And it might be worth it to smudge on some details that would go against courtroom truth in order to honor the the larger truth of the story, or what your belief is. Not to lie, but to just emphasize the right elements of where you're coming from and where you're speaking. Do you see those distinctions as somebody who's really like pursued that through your writing, and pursued truth and your definition of it through your writing?
It's such a deep question, because at different levels of reality, different things are true. So um, what do we even mean by truth? I think we exist in some reality. I think we can all agree to that, or at least it feels that way in our consciousness. And that reality, by definition, must have qualities to it. And that's what I mean by truth, is identifying what those qualities are.
Mm.
And there's so many of them and so many layers to it. I've become less and less tolerant of the partial truths to give a general fuzzy picture. And I'm much more hardcore on paradigms. Like, if a paradigm claims to be a model of reality, if there's a single anomaly that the model cannot accommodate, to me, the model's dead, because a model should be able to accommodate all observations. And so the anomalies to me are that's what I end up latching onto, is, okay, this anomaly is here. Therefore, this thing that's pretty good at predicting a lot of things in the world, it is no longer valid to me, because it can't predict this one thing. Something's wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where maybe in the past I would have said, well, look, it's pretty good. It's practical. Now I'm saying, no, like, something's up here. We've got to get to the bottom of it. It's like, if the law is every swan is white and you find one black swan, the law has been violated. Therefore, the law is incorrect. So we have to come up with a new law, a new model that could accommodate. How did you see this one black swan?
I love this. I think I have a story that we can work with. Would you like to hear your story that you can share?
I'd love to hear it. Thank you.
I can remember sitting in my doctor's office listening to a podcast, totally immersed in my research process, and a certain feeling in my stomach coming up. This would be a feeling that I would begin to get used to over the years, but it was one of the first times ever. You see, I had caught wind of this idea, this shift that was possible. And when I catch wind of this, I start to learn as much as I can about whatever topic that may be. And I'm listening to a podcast about health in my health expert's office right now. And all of a sudden, it's dawning on me that one of the ways that I've looked at this for my whole life, that everybody around me has told me things are this way. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing something for the first time that maybe the sun doesn't go around the earth after all, and something's a little bit different. Sorry for the Galileo reference. That might not be necessary. But something might be a little bit different, but I feel scared because if I start to talk about this and share this truth, like people don't like to change their ideas and their opinions on this level, but there's also part of me that knows I need to get to the bottom of this. And time after time after time, I would set out on a process of learning through one paradigm shift or another, and through the process of a lot of costly and painful mistakes of studying and writing and refining, I would begin to cultivate each of these messages. And within them all, I saw that there was this process of really staying with the truth long enough to let it be heard, of continuing to ask questions, of continuing to sit with it, no matter the uncomfortable thoughts, no matter the implications of what the changes may be. And I began to see this as one of the most important practices of my life, of helping me adapt and understand to this world that's rapidly changing and changing faster. And I really knew I was on to something when it wasn't just me that started to feel liberated from the books that I was reading, but it was our writing, but it was those reaching out to me. Some who felt that I had changed and transformed from my writing and didn't like what I did anymore. But I saw it as a way of my growth and my pursuit. And more new people who, for the first time, were seeing new opportunities and new possibilities in the world right now. And I realized that no matter what segment or area, from UFOs to medicine to politics, that I worked in, that the more that we could open ourselves up to new possibilities, sit with the truth, and truly understand the implications of what is, the better that we could respond to our world and create within this world that is. And over so many years of working in technology and investments and trying to understand how things work, I now have a process for crystallizing this one at a time. And that's what I'm here, and that's what I represent in my books for you. How's that?
You are very good at this, Kyle. That was super impressive.
Good. And hopefully that's the kind of back to the courtroom truth idea of it's probably not perfectly your story yet, and it wasn't exactly the right details and the right sequence, but I think it touched on your truth in a way that was really fun to explore throughout this episode.
Yeah, for sure. You were very skilled.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you are as well. And it's very fun to have experts and leaders like you who have spent so much time in their own forests, their deeply forested things, and to be able to light a way to a new path easier and quicker than they might have seen on their own. So it's been an absolute blast getting to explore this with you on the show.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Um,
Kyle.
do you have some closing thoughts to wrap this up based on the process that we've been into that you'd like to leave the audience with?
I think studying your line of questioning as I gave answers is one of the biggest takeaways of this whole podcast of hearing someone's story and knowing where to lead. So I'm going to go back and look at the way that you guided the conversation because I haven't heard it done this way before.
Well, as our mutual friend that introduced us says, game recognizes game. And I'm honored in that insight. And where can we go to learn more about you? Give us a quick overview of all of the books so we know which one is the most important. There's something for everybody,
Okay.
but definitely, yeah,
Thank
one
you.
will upset you and one will delight
Yeah, that's probably true. So all my books, first of all, there I have a website which is just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. It has information on my books and also my podcast series from 2019, which is about consciousness called Where is My Mind? With regard to the books, the first one is called An End to Upside Down Thinking. All these are on Amazon also, and they're in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible format. And I've read all the Audibles myself. But An End to Upside Down Thinking is challenging the belief that our consciousness comes from our brain and instead views the brain more like an antenna receiver of consciousness or a filtering mechanism. And it goes through the science of that. The second book is called An End to Upside Down Living, which talks about the implications of living life with this new perspective about consciousness and our nature of reality. So it's the journey of spiritual awakening and also personal development. The third book, which is where I started to ruffle a lot more feathers, is a political book. It's called An End to Upside Down Liberty. And it talks about the philosophy of voluntarism, which is all about voluntary exchanges between basically a customer and a service provider, whereas government inherently is a political monopoly, and that creates all sorts of ripple effect issues. And I go through the problems with that and a potential solution and tie it into the consciousness work that I did before, moving toward what I think is a better political and economic system way in the future, probably not in the near term. The next book is An End to Upside Down Contact, which documents contact with non-human intelligences, whether it's alleged UFO encounters, people's encounters with spirits, people calling things aliens, looking historically what people have said in the ancient mythologies to the present time, what's out there. And it's hard to know exactly what's true, but I wanted to document all of it. And I think the conclusion is there's other stuff out there. It's hard to know exactly what it is. It's complicated, but it's there. The fifth book is called An End to the Upside Down Reset, which talks about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset program, which was launched officially in 2020. And it laid out basically it's sociological. It's where should society be headed politically, economically, socioculturally, and so forth, technologically. And I go through what the plan is and I critique it. Ultimately, I think it's one that's not about liberty, whereas I'm much more of a pro-liberty person, especially based on my book on liberty. So I laid out what the Great Reset plan is because many people have heard the term, and I actually use the quotations from the book that talks about the Great Reset, so explaining what it is and why it's potentially not a good direction for us. And the most recent book is called An End to Upside Down Medicine. And this challenges the allopathic approach to medicine, both from the perspective of, let's just say, traditional notions of germ theory, of microbial organisms that are launching attacks against healthy tissue. Is that the true story? Or do those microbes actually show up because you're toxic from something else and the microbes get blamed? Like in that case, a bacterial infection, sure that you could get very sick from that and the bacteria emit toxins as an example, but maybe the bacteria were there in such high quantities because there was something that they were decomposing because the person was sick because of toxicity. Just one example. So I go through, these things where we just come to a conclusion about a cause and say, well, maybe there's another cause that can explain this. And then I also tie it into consciousness and go into energy healing and biofields and all these other things that the allopathic approach could benefit from, but doesn't study quite enough.
Brilliant. Like I said, something for everyone. Mark Gober, thank you so much for joining us today on the Story Engine podcast.